Hello, ladies and gents. It's Justin Johnson. Happy Thursday, the 12th of January. We're on the module DD211 on my academic integrity of arts and humanities, which is history and politics. We've got through two modules already. I'm on my third module. We're on understanding politics, ideas, and institutions in the modern world, which is module DD211. I want to influence you today, young adults, mature teenagers, young teenagers, and OAPs. Keep yourself methodical in practice. When you read this, make sure you reference your reading. The Open University Walton Hall Milton Keynes MK76AA, first published 2015, second edition 2022. We're on the page 112, chapter 16, Group Politics in the UK and the US. Groups and the state. In both the UK and the US, government is charged with steering the state by making use of its fiscal reach and legal powers. The government, subject to electoral opinion, governs hierarchically, but has always to anticipate the likely reaction of the public and powerful interest groups. The more powerful the interest, the more likely the state is to respond to its claims, with occasional exceptions. However, the relationship between groups and government is asymmetrical. This is the following reasons. Government possesses power and authority, even if it possesses less power than it did before. Citizens still consider it to be a mechanism to deal with issues and resolve problems. Groups thus to try to influence or, at the very least, to shout loudly at government. Government, however, often decides which group it wishes to listen to or work with, or has to acknowledge. In terms of policy making, it is, in the final analysis, government decides because groups merely advise, or in the case of some, despise what government has done or intends to do. These groups have to engage with traditional politics. The state, not least the government charged with its affairs, remain alongside national and international economic and social process. The ultimate arbiter of what happens in the UK, the groups cannot ignore or bypass the state, but have instead to try and persuade it, plead with it, or challenge it to respond to their issue or cause. They often use the media to publicly make their case and attract public support. Groups can also try to coerce the state. Naturally, not all groups are equal. Some are more powerful than others. Groups are strong or weak, large or small, professional or amateur. They can also be elite or non-elite. Certain interest groups can garner special privileges. They have better access to decision makers and, if never guaranteed, to have their interests advanced. They are at least given a hearing within government. This is because certain groups have particular access to power and influence. Such groups may be constituted by economic power, by personal wealth, or by status. Alternatively, they may be class-based, sharing a common political and cultural outlook. In liberal democratic societies, these groups are sometimes known as the establishment. For instance, business interests often have powers and privileges denied others. Owing to the central role that the economy plays in the generation of national wealth, on which both private and public life depends. In the context of both the UK and the US, they involve those men and women who historically less often, with financial or industrial muscle, who network with politicians, and those in top administrative positions in the government and within the state. One example of the elite group, then, would be top business people, a kind of financial industrial oligarchy, which activity is to manage much of the economic resource of the country. Economic clout, personal ties, and shared cultural outlook means they wield a great deal of power, perhaps unaccountable power, in tradition, inasmuch as they share convictions and similar outlooks with political elites. They can influence, some would say, unduly influence political processes as well. As we have seen, the means by which groups approach the state, the modus operandi they choose, is structured by the prevailing political system. Groups are invariably influenced by the status they have been granted by or have been able to demand from. Government here. The following distinction between different types of associational or promotional groups is useful. An insider group is one that operates inside the state and which has its views sought out by government. They are included in policy-making networks and communities and are frequently consulted by government ministers and agency heads. For instance, in the UK, such insider groups include the British Medical Association and the National Farmers Union, who make their representations known directly by bargaining and negotiating with policymakers, necessarily making concessions and compromises. In the US, the American Medical Association, the American Federation of Labor and Congress of Industrial Organizations, the AFL and CIO, and the Pharmaceutical Research and the Manufacturers of America have some similar access to policymakers, but few interests enjoy an insider status. By contrast, an outsider group is one that's not routinely consulted by ministers or by agenda heads. Instead, they make representation, should they choose to do so. Indirectly and usually by mobilising public support for their cause, outsider groups like Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth, or human rights campaigners like Liberty in the UK or the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU. In the US, jealously guard their independence. They are not prepared to make concessions nor compromise on their policy demands. Broadly speaking, promotional groups tend to be outsiders and associational groups are more likely to be insiders. Promotional groups have to be popular, but associational groups need to be necessary to reflect a climate of opinion. They need to be powerful or else relevant to the government policy community. 4.1 Protest and dissent. For some outsider groups, especially radical groups influenced by politics of the far left or right, protest is a key activity. Those who seek to change the state and oppose government policy often employ strategies of dissent. The physical obstruction of public spaces, of chaining oneself to the railings outside the public buildings, has been a feature of protest from the time of women's suffrage movement in the early 20th century, through to the peace movement of the 1950s in the 1980s, and protests by students, supporters and opponents of abortion rights and disability activists in the 2000s. Such groups tend to be less organisationally coherent and often involve collection of groups affiliated together as a social movement, whereas most associational groups tend to accept the formal rules of political participation and seek to change policy and laws by parliamentary means. Promotional groups, especially those involved in social movements, are often more willing to engage in extra parliamentary action and even civil disobedience. The activity that groups engage is largely prompted by their attitude to the state. If the groups accept the legitimacy of the state, it means the way in which it operates and the ends it seeks, the policies that it pursues. Its activists will be the moderate, sober and supportive of the political system. If the group accepts the legitimacy of the state and its means, but objects to the ends it seeks, its activities will be assertive and it will seek, by playing the game, to change the system and policies it objects to, either from the inside by lobbying or from the outside by campaigning and protesting. If the group rejects the legitimacy of the state and it means and objects to the ends it seeks, its activities will be aggressive and will refuse to play a game and seek only to change the system and the policies it objects to from the outside by campaigning and protesting, by changing both the means and the ends of the political system and by proposing alternative means and ends. Not all groups pursue these three forms of activity, but radical protest groups are much more likely to pursue the second and the third. These forms of activity can involve actions beyond legality, such as civil disobedience, but such actions will reject the use of violence and legality associated with activities such as terrorism. Most associational and promotional groups accept, even if the question, the legitimacy of the state, even if it's challenged its specific proposals, they have to confine their activity to peaceful non-violent and mostly lawful means. Even the small protest groups most influenced by far left will seek to subvert the status quo, invariably pursue reformist, not revolutionary, objectives. They may work outside and around the state, but they know they have not a chance of over, over, overthrowing the state. Groups engaged in violent extremist activity like the loose, often incoherent groups which associate themselves with Islamist extremism. It needs to be studied under different, narrower criteria. Manny, thank you for the favourite. Page 116, still on chapter 16. How political system, groups and social movements. The UK still sits in the end of ℙ scale, which distinguishes the ideal type majority and democratic system from its consensus counterpart. Thank you ever so much. I'm reading my academics, which is arts and humanities. Such a democracy, ℙ argues, has a pluralist interest group system, which features a competitive and uncoordinated pluralism of independent groups, in a contrast with the coordinated and compromise-orientated system of cooperativism. This is a typical of the consensus model, 1999, page 171. In the case of the UK, Flinders 2009 finds that this was not changed by the recent Labour governments, which only lightly modified the majoritarianism of the accepted-minded Westminster model. The US, if it is largely a consensus power-sharing democracy, it exhibits elements of majoritarism in terms of the electoral system and its competitive, uncoordinated and wholly pluralistic interest group universe. Groups matter in the US, and they play the system more effectively than the groups can in the UK. This is because groups and movements, advocating interests and claims, have to operate with the prevailing political structures thrown up by the political system, and so, because the political systems in operation in the UK and the US are so different. Then the modules operandi of both groups and movements differ significantly in the UK and the US. Accessing the state and having a state to respond to claims in the UK and the US is very different from following reasons. The US has a federal presidential political system, while the UK has a unitary parliamentary system. The US Congress is independent to the US executive, but the UK Parliament is much more subservient to the UK executive. US elections are much more expensive to fight than UK elections, so US politicians are more receptive to certain interests and claims. Paid professional lobbyists can wield considerable power in the US Congress, but the UK counterparts are far more or less influential. The US has a fixed constitution of often preventing government from doing things, whereas the UK has a flexible constitution enabling government to do things. The US has a federal and the UK a unitary political system. The US, being a federal presidential polity, offers a great many opportunities for interest groups to access the system. The US divides governmental power two ways. First, vertically between all 50 states of the Union and federal government, which represents all the states. Second, horizontally within the federal government and each of the state governments by separating the powers of the presidency, the Congress and the Supreme Court, the executive, the legislature and the judiciary, so enabling each branch of government to check and balance each other. Interest groups can thus seek to influence each other, all of the three branches of the federal government, and those of the 50 states. From the local to the national, the state to the federal level, there are therefore numerous points by which groups can access the system. A Californian interest group, say, can lobby the California governor and representatives at the state level in the state House of Representatives and the state Senate. It can lobby the mayors and assembly persons of cities and towns, or it can approach the chief executives of counties and local governments at the federal level. The group can approach California 2 US senators and 52 US congressmen. Yeah, do that. It's no problem. Do that. The group can lobby the relevant part of the executive branch, or should it seek to have the federal government intervene in a California matter, it can try to influence other 384 members of the US House of Representatives and the other 98 members of the Senate. In contrast, within the UK unitary parliamentary system, there are far fewer access points to the interest groups. Scottish, Welsh, and Northern Irish devolution has created new forums within which groups can operate. But the reach of these forums only encompass some 15% of the UK population, and often their policy competences lend into little groups. Whitehall, the executive, and Westminster legislature remain the focus of attention for the groups seeking to speak for the remaining 85% of the Britons beyond lesser local issues. Local government and often does not count because it lacks power. Groups in the UK beyond not those exclusively operating in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland have to seek access at Whitehall and Westminster. There are therefore far fewer points by which access to state in the UK compared to the US. Last 2 pages, I believe. Page 118. The US Congress is independent of the government, but the UK Parliament is much more subservient to the government. The US presidential system restricts the power of the president by empowering an independent and powerful Congress. Groups can lobby both the collective House of Representatives and the Senate, which are, unlike the UK, that's my mum, separate from and independent of the government. They can lobby in congressmen and senators alike, secure in the knowledge that those elected officials can respond to their concerns and, if supported and sufficiently senior, take up their case. With the House of Commons being a much more important lawmaker than the Lords, there is in the UK essentially only one really effective legislative chamber for the interest groups to lobby in. The Lords is a revising chamber with far less impact on public policy, which has few opportunities to hold the government to account. However, because the UK government, unlike the US presidency, make use of its parliamentary majority to pursue its legislative programme according to its chosen timetable, the Commons is a reactive, not a proactive legislator. Government, by all means, of its Commons majority, is in charge of lawmaking. This means that MPs, being divided into frontbench and backbench, opposition and government, are less well placed than the more autonomous independent US senator or the congressman to help a group advance its cause by lawmaking law, unlike the US minority legislator, whose support is often needed to make law in the US Congress, and opposition backbench Westminster MP can at best only raise or state the interest group's case, not pass laws on its behalf. Ministers, not MPs, tend to make the most of important decisions. In the US, interest groups can have congressmen and senators enact laws on their behalf. Or more pertinently, they can have them stymie efforts by their critics to act against interest by preventing them from acting. 5.3. US elections are much more expensive to fight than UK elections. US and UK differ considerably in the way groups use money to highlight their interests or cause by influence in electoral politics. Interests and causes have less opportunity to enter the electoral arena in the UK in comparison with the US campaign. Finance is the livelihood of the US election campaign. Candidates and campaigns have to raise a great deal of money to be elected. In 2018, the average House race cost the winning candidate some $2 million, and the Senate race cost $15.75 million. Candidates and campaigners for all the parties in these 2018 midterms, when all of the House and a third of the Senate were up for election, spent $5.7 billion in their race for the presidency in 2020. Joe Biden spent $1.69 billion and Donald Trump spent $1.91 billion. 12 years earlier, in 2008, Barack Obama raised and spent $553 million and winning the presidency, and John Cain $379 million. In 2016, Hillary Clinton outspent Trump by $768 million to $398 million, and at the 2010 general election, in stark contrast, total reported national campaign expenditure by all political parties across the UK was $31.5 million. And 33 registered campaign groups spent reported total $2.8 million. Electoral Commission 2010 at the 2017 UK election, some $40 million was spent by the political parties and other campaign organisations. Electoral Commission 2018 and in 2019 the Conservative Party spent $16 million. on its winning campaign, Electoral Commission cited in Xiao 2020. Elections are expensive in the US. Candidates and campaigns need to raise vast sums of money from both citizens and interests. Spending vast sums of money is not possible in the UK. Party finance is tightly regulated by law. Parties are prevented from buying paid television advertisement, so they need to seek such funds to expend. Interests in the US are able legally to funnel money to the US parties and candidates in large measure. They need to not necessarily buy a candidate, merely reward those who agree with their cause, opposing those candidates who do not, ensuring their cause is promoted by their favoured candidate. This cannot happen in UK elections, and it gives interest and in with candidates and campaigns. Paid professional lobbyists can wield considerable power in the US Congress, but the UK counterparts are far less influential. In the US, professional lobbyists are the guns for fire, for personal interest, boasting unrivaled insider knowledge of the political system. They are identified and help exploit entry into the system by facilitating exchange between companies, interests, and politicians. They themselves form a multi-million-dollar industry. When President Obama and Congress were reforming healthcare in 2009, healthcare industry groups. Gonna keep that there. Ladies and gentlemen, how are we? I know it is pretty